Let me just get started right away with my response. I too, like Victoria Bernal, took the area studies part of the provocation and the question as one of the key things to talk about. And in essence, the two questions that I kept thinking about was how have new media reshaped the study of international questions and locations, and what are the implications for area studies? And in part, these questions interested me because my own trajectory in the academic world coincided with the move away from established area studies models. And I think this has one of the reasons has to do with the disciplinary side from which I speak, which is media and cultural studies, which sits at an oblique yet very interesting angle from social and cultural anthropology. But for one reason or another, the book that I was handed when I showed up for graduate school in the United States was Arjuna Padure's Modernity at Large. Um, and the book came out in 96 and, of course, was built on one particular essay, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy, which came out in 1990. And now this essay and the book have been the subject of many critiques, many of them well-founded and important. But there's no denying that Apadura and other scholars who are involved in setting up, redefining and setting up public culture as a key term for thinking about media and identity in a post-1989 world was key to mine, but also the entire body of scholarship that looks specifically at media and migration. And of course, he was one of the first, or among many, to argue for a shift away from what he was calling trait geography to process geography in an age of global capital. Middle East, honor, South Asia, caste, sort of getting away from that sort of trait geography. And so if Apadura is one of the figures who encouraged me to delve into the history of area studies in South Asia, the other development that shaped my own thinking on media and migration was diaspora studies that came out of British cultural studies, particularly Stuart Hall. We could call Stuart Hall 2.0, when Stuart Hall discovered his own ethnic positionality within Britain beyond his Marxist self. And also Paul Gilroy and many others who went on to encourage younger scholars, including Mary Gillespie in the UK, who did a wonderful, very early ethnography of media and migration in Southall among Punjabi communities. And then in the American context, Sunaina Myra's work among Indian American youth, for example, in the 90s in New York City. Now, all this to say that Joe Straubar's work for me fits within a body of scholarship that has been interested in the question of new media and social change for quite a long time now. So we've talked a little bit about diasporic histories, but perhaps we should also talk a little bit more about the histories of newness and the way in which we've thought about newness with media in particular. And I wanted to, especially when you think about diasporic media, you have to think about remix music, diasporic cinema, and television shows like Goodness Gracious Me, which really force us to rethink what we call new in this particular moment of new media. And you can't mention Goodness Gracious Me without watching at least one clip. And it's hilarious, it's fun, and we should watch it. And this one I picked partly because of its sort of area studies connotations. And it's a parody, as the title says, of Common People. Does everyone know this song, Common People? I want to live with common people. Well, you'll get it. Pay attention to the sort of lyrics down at the bottom if you can. And I think I'll have to keep it small just to let it play quickly. Are we good with the volume for this? No? Yeah? Anyone? Volume? Yeah, that one's all the way up. Yeah. We don't have to hold it up for this bit. I hate to inflict you with my singing, but oh, and there's Lucy Parker. Her skin was white, but she preferred it darker. That's why I caught her eye. We met at York. She was a first-year student. She wore a sari 'cause she thought it prudent. I thought fine. And then in 30 seconds time, and this is the key. Okay. Oh, no. Well, I want to live like Hindi people. I want to do whatever Hindi people do. I want to sleep with Hindi people, like you. Well, what else could I do? I smiled and I said, do you want a Vindaloo? All right, we should move on. Um, this is just to suggest that there are long histories of thinking through new media and social change, particularly from a diasporic perspective, that completely and utterly confounds any area studies paradigm you can think of. And so this body of scholarship, at least for me, has quite neatly sidestepped the area studies paradigm. And so instead of asking where in the world is digital Texas, it's perhaps far more productive and important to ask how is digital Texas in the world and its inhabitants, of course. And so to map the complex connections across multiple layers and spatial scales that Straub focused on, I also found it useful to think in terms of scale in particular. And Joe's heard me at another conference say this, and particularly anthropologist Anna Singh's recent work, in which she talks about scale as a spatial dimensionality that's necessary for a particular kind of view, whether up close from a distance, but also microscopic or planetary, the entire sort of stretch. And a scale, she says, is to be understood not just as a neutral frame for viewing the world, but rather as something that must be brought into being, quote, proposed, practiced, evaded, as well as taken for granted. So approaching digital Texas as a scale-making project, I found it useful to ask, what does it take to conjure the diaspora as a scale of mediation from a range of perspectives? Parents and their children, the city and its zoning committees, state-level organizations, community activists, and media companies all the way from small-scale radio channels to large multinational media conglomerates. And so approaching a site like Digital Texas does not just reveal the interpenetration of scales, national, global, regional, diasporic, urban, neighborhood, that Straub mapped so well for us, but what it also makes clear is that the various actors and institutions that are caught up in producing this Digital Texas cannot just limit themselves to conjuring at these different scales, but that they must conjure the scales themselves. And I think this goes to some of what Ruth Behar was saying is, for instance, we might want to think about how mothers and daughters conjure a certain scale of belonging in everyday life in a way that, let's say, institutional actors who are involved in digital Texas just would not, right? And now Strauber's presentation illustrated all the ideological power-laden aspects of all of this, right? The way in which Austin as a city was shaped, the way in which its zoning laws worked, and so on. But what I also found particularly illuminating in his discussion was his insistence on approaching the question of migrant identity through a much longer life story trajectory, which opens up an opportunity to develop a more geographically nuanced account of life in the diaspora. I don't think it's an overstatement at all to say that diaspora and ethnic studies, from an Asian American perspective in particular, has been a largely coasty enterprise, with New York and Bay Area being the privileged sites and Chicago makes the occasional appearance. But what Joe's project really forces us to think about is how the discourse of the heartland in America. And there's a new book out by Vicki Johnson called Heartland Television, which very nicely maps the way in which common sense ideals regarding citizenship, national identity, and cultural worth have been debated and discussed in relation to this discourse of the heartland that is so central to questions of American identity. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from Joe about other migrant trajectories, particularly those in small town and rural Texas, the heartland, that figure prominently. To invoke the best to date, in my opinion, instance of media representation of rural Texas, the otherwise brilliant ethnographic portrait of Dillon, Texas in NBC's Friday Night Lights, is somehow not as sure-footed when it comes to its Latino characters. Coach Pablo, Santiago Herrera, Carloto Alonza, and the unnamed Mexican police officer who never accepts bribes in Dillon do complicate Dillon's racial and ethnic politics in ways that diaspora studies somehow seems to miss. And so, as I said, Strauber's account and to an extent Professor Behar's response forced us to think about Austin, its city, its racial and ideological dimensions, and all of that. But I want to bracket those questions of power and ideology for just one moment, if you can. And there were two stories in Joe's presentation that I want to return to. One of them was about Maria, who insists on having a Spanish language television channel on in the background because she wants her grandsons to learn the language. And the other is about Susanna from Houston, who is chatting on the phone with her mother, who's in a town outside Monterrey. And her mother asks her one day to tune into multimedias because there is a news story on about a policeman being killed in Sabinas. And she tells her, quote, "Someone kidnapped X, tune into multimedias now." And Susanna does, as her mother tells her to, and they continue talking while they watch the news program together in different places at the same time. And these two stories sort of made me wonder about the fact that the very fact of scale making, of constructing a life for oneself in the diaspora, is also at one level a very routine and quite unremarkable activity. So how would we read these two stories? So for many of us, the area of area studies has been redefined, and we've run with it for all these years. But now when it actually comes to answering the question of, let's say, how is digital Texas in the world, we seem to be coming back to a well-worn path defined by critical theory that in the end has to be about questions of power and ideology. Now, all that is fine, but in that process, are we paying adequate attention to what Homi Bhabha once called the utter seriousness of idle conversation? Do Susanna and her mother speak often, perhaps every day, if only for a few minutes? And when they do talk, what do they talk about? Work? Husbands and partners? Children? School? Perhaps the mother asks Susanna if her grandchildren are learning Spanish, like Maria does, worry about her grandsons. She worries perhaps about how she'll interact with them as they grow up in Houston and she's still in Monterey. Do they talk about groceries and food? Dinner menus, perhaps, because this is an evening news program they're watching together? What if in Susanna and her mother's conversation, be it via the telephone or Skype, or the asynchronous status updates and likes on Facebook, we sense on both their parts nothing more than a desire to be at home, in whatever ways those homes may have been redefined. In asking this, I'm not suggesting that we cast aside the fact that even such routine conversations are shaped by broader political fields, but rather it is to ask what domains of life and practices of life making in the diaspora have we ignored? Perhaps our theoretical gaze needs to dwell just a little bit longer in these sorts of moments as well. And as we reimagine the area of area studies in terms of macro-scalar sites like nation, diaspora, region, city, and so on, it might also be worth considering a much more micro-level redefinition, such that we take everyday life as an important area from within which we understand new media use and social change. Right? So I'll leave my provocation at that and questions and so on.